Great. While people are entering the room, I think it's a good chance to get started. I want to welcome everybody to this event. I'm Kim Strom. I'm the director of the Office of Ethics and Policy here at UNC. And this session tonight is one of a series of educational programs that we offer, sponsored by the Office of Ethics and Policy. It's a fantastic opportunity to have a conversation about organizations and supporting ethics and ethical behavior in organizations. So I welcome all of you who are joining. Our event is being recorded so that it will be available through our Ethics and Policy at UNC website in the future. Also, for those of you who are local to Chapel Hill and who may not have already had a chance to purchase the book, they're available at Flyleaf, and Flyleaf is offering a discount for this event. So I encourage you to check in with them. My office, the Office of Ethics and Policy, was created in 2016 following scandals at the University of North Carolina that imperiled the university's accreditation and NCAA standing. And our mission is to help build and support a climate of integrity at Carolina. I am a professor at Carolina since 1999. I've been a professor at the School of Social Work, and I'm the Smith P. Thiemann Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Professional Practice. And my research is about, in later years, in recent years, has been about moral distress and moral courage. And that is, what are the things in us and in our organizations that keep us from doing the right thing? And so you can imagine how resonant the upcoming conversation is with the topics that I'm interested in studying and that I'm interested in disseminating through my own work. So how fortunate for me to be here tonight in the presence of amazing experienced journalists whose vast work has brought Emmys and Pulitzer Prizes. Let me just do brief introductions. Susan King has an amazing career in journalism, including serving as ABC News White House correspondent, Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs in the Clinton administration, founder and leader of the Carnegie Knight Initiative on the Future of Journalism Education at the Carnegie Corporation in New York, and serving for 10 years as the John Thomas Carr Distinguished Professor and Dean at our UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media. And I note that UNC drew inspiration for these events of Global Ethics Month from the Carnegie Commission and on ethics. So Global Ethics Day is a perfect synergy with this. Paul Pringle is a Los Angeles Times reporter who specializes in investigating corruption. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2009 and a member of reporting teams that won Pulitzer Prizes in 2004, 2011, and 2019. That latest award was for uncovering widespread sexual abuse by Dr. George Tyndall at the University of Southern California, and an inquiry that grew out of their reporting the year before on Dr. Carmen Puliafito, then the dean of USC's medical school. And these two cases form the core of the book we're discussing tonight and the interests that we bring to this conversation. Paul and his colleagues have received Harvard University's 2011 Worth Bingham Prize for investigative reporting, the California Newspaper Publishers Association Freedom of Information Award in 2014, and the University of Florida's Brechner Freedom of Information Award in 2015. So I stand among giants. I'm going to try not to fangirl too much during our time together. I think we have a lot of expertise at the table. So when Susan first arrived at UNC, she and I bonded over book discussions. And I think every time our paths crossed, it was, what are you reading? What do you like? What do you recommend? So last month, when I was in the middle of reading Paul's book, Bad City, with my book group, I immediately thought of Susan and our shared interests in moral courage and in the power of investigative journalism. And so I reached out to her, and no surprise, she had already read it. And now we are very grateful to have the chance to talk with the author himself about all of our thoughts and questions. And we invite you, attendees, to contribute to the conversation. You can post your questions or comments in the Q&A box. And my colleagues from Ethics and Policy will be collecting and sorting and forwarding those throughout the program, and I will give voice to them as we talk. So first, let's welcome Paul. And Paul, if you'll start by giving an overview, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, the overview you touched on, it's just that back in 2016, I received a tip that came into the newspaper through a staff photographer. Somebody we later identified as a hotel manager at a hotel where a young woman overdosed in the room of the dean of the medical school of the University of Southern California. So that tip led to my initial investigation, and I immediately encountered cover-ups and stonewalling by the city of Pasadena, where the overdose occurred, and at USC. And that continued for quite some time until I was able to finally break through by using the California Public Records Act and knocking on doors and that sort of thing. And eventually it led to the first story about Puliafito, which was not published by the paper. And in response to that, I and my immediate editor, city editor Matt Late, put together a secret team of reporters within our own newsroom to continue to pursue the story. That led to a much bigger story where we essentially made it something you would have to publish, you could not kill. Just to fast forward, eventually it was published. The dean lost, he was fired. He had already stepped down from the deanship, which we can come back to later. And as you noted, that scandal led to the second scandal involving the campus gynecologist. And he was also, by that time he had left the university, but he is now awaiting trial on 30-some felonies in connection with, the alleged abuse of his patients over a great many years.
And I believe the university had there was a class action suit as well around his behavior.
Several class action suits, and their combined result was $1.1 billion in settlements for these women who were allegedly abused by Tyndall.
Some of the book makes very hard reading, the exploitation theme throughout that. Tell us about the people of conscience in the book. As you said, the hotel manager. What motivated or motivates people to take risks like this? And what do they as whistleblowers need from the rest of us?
Well, it's right on point with the program. It's their ethics. And these scandals would have never been uncovered without these whistleblowers who put everything on the line, their jobs, their reputations. When we're talking about the young woman who overdosed and her family, as well as a nurse and others in the Tyndall case, they put everything on the line simply to do the right thing. And before they came to us, the Los Angeles Times, they did everything right in the other respects. They reported what they knew and saw internally. In the case of the hotel manager, he called 911. He made sure the police were notified. When nothing was done about the dean and the overdose, even though they found amphetamine in his room, there was no arrest, there was no police report even filed. The manager, Devon Kahn is his name, continued to press. He filed a complaint with the city attorney's office. He called the office of USC's president and gave a very detailed account of what he witnessed, and still nothing happened. He even tried to reach the LA Times, but just by calling our tip line, and unfortunately, I suppose whoever answered the phone, it was probably a switchboard person, told him he'd have to leave a voicemail. Well, because he was putting not just his job, but his career on the line by going outside the hotel to report the conduct of a guest, he didn't even want to do that. He thought that was too risky, and he was probably right. So it was only through this circumstance where he ended up at a party where one of my colleagues was attending. He told the photographer, Ricardo, that what he saw. Ricardo brought the tip into the newsroom, and that tip eventually came to me. And that led to, again, these other folks coming forward, putting their names on the record. Sarah Warren, the young woman who overdosed, she went on the record about everything that she had been involved with: arrests, drug abuse, a brief time as a prostitute. Her parents helped me, bring this story to light. They turned over to me scores of photographs and videos showing the dean doing illicit drugs with the circle of young people. He was providing drugs too. And then again, to skip ahead to the Tyndall case, the nurse, Cindy Gilbert, she spoke to my colleagues, Harriet Ryan and Matt Hamilton, about what she had witnessed with Tyndall and what she had reported to the university to no avail. So again, these are the people, these are the heroes in this story.
What makes them tick? What makes them, because obviously there were other people around. Is it character? Is it outrage? Are they sorry they did it? How do we help them and help people, others of us, be like them?
It was a combination. Again, they're honorable people who saw dishonorable things happen that would not be addressed in a normal way. And that did cause them to become outraged. And certainly in Devon Kahn's case, he just has a deep sense of right and wrong. He had encountered his own mistreatment in his life that he rebelled against. And he was just determined that this had to be addressed, again, no matter what. And I can't stress how risky it was for him. His wife was very concerned. They had a young child, that he would lose his job. As I remember, he was forced out of an earlier job for reporting wrongdoing by somebody on behalf of a colleague. And in the case of Cindy Gilbert, the nurse, she did suffer. She did the right thing. And as a result, the university retaliated against her and eventually, forced her to quit a job that she loved. It didn't, she knew that was a risk. Her husband worked at the school as a physician. She knew that he could possibly be jeopardized by this, but she did it anyway. And again, it was out of a sense of, doing the right thing. There was moral outrage involved. And again, if that didn't happen, we wouldn't be talking. And these men, these powerful men, not just the two doctors, but the people who protected them, would most likely still be in place, and people would still be getting hurt.
Kim, I want to ask you a question, because I think, as Paul is describing these people, the immense risk, American journalism for years has had this kind of, sources that really are the voices, the heroes, as you say. And I've never thought of them as people of conscience the way you did. So can you elevate what might be a source or someone who come in? We want to explore more with Paul, but tell us how people like this exist and their moral courage.
Me, from the folks that I've talked with, yeah.
And from your scholarship, it's so,
sure.
we think of how lucky we are to have them, but this is an incredible group of people who feel
Right.
that ethical core.
A lot of them will say, I can look myself in the mirror in the morning. And so it's that and sometimes it comes from, they often don't see their own activities as courageous, even though they may have paid a really high price. They see it as it was the right thing to do. There is an outrage, a desire to protect weaker persons. There are some people who, when they're stonewalled, that redoubles their outrage or their moral acuity to act. Some people will say to me that the price of not acting is as high as the price of acting. There's a John McCain quote about finding out you're less the person than you pretend to be. But a lot of the folks I interview will just say, I never want to put myself in a position again where I'm remorseful of not speaking up. We kick ourselves around for not speaking up. You speak up and it's maybe another form of harm, but it's a harm where you feel like you did the best you could, even if it was futile, which it was for many of the people in the Tyndall case, especially, that preceded Cindy Gilbert, right?
And
So-
Paul, I wanted to ask you, as I've been so struck by the kind of research that Kim's done talking about folks of conscience, but also what's different about this book is it's not just journalism. It's your story about finding the people and the amount of work that it took and kind of what drove you. And investigative reporters are a unique breed of journalists. You're not recording the first draft of history. You know, you're going deeper for something. So tell our audience here what motivates you, what sort of the ethics, you know, of your soul, because you also, because it's your book, you're very clear that you were outraged at various moments. What motivates you?
Well, what first motivated me is that it was just a good story. I mean, in a bad way, but it was a good story. The dean of a medical school at the scene of an overdose of a young woman. And at that point, we didn't even know if she survived. We only had a first name for her and a physical description, nothing else. And the fact that the police did absolutely nothing. So there's a story right there. And I originally thought it might be a fairly easy story to report and a fairly quick one. It came to me because it was about USC, not because there was a belief up front that it was going to require a deep investigation. But I had experience dealing with USC and particularly USC's lack of transparency. So I guess in a bit of naivete, went chase this story, figured I'd have it done in a week or two. And no, it became something much bigger. And that was because of the cover-ups I encountered, the stonewalling, and that got me, that fed my, I guess, outrage, just professional outrage anyway, not quite at the moral outrage point. And it's like, it's like a challenge. We're not going to give you any information, no matter how important this story might be to you and to the public. And I'm just not going to stand for that. And every step of the way, they made it as difficult as possible. And each time they did that, I was more determined to press ahead. And then there's just the matter of justice. Just if this had been many other people in that hotel room who had no money, who had no influence, no power, there would have been an arrest. There would have been a police report, of course. There would have been action. And even if there hadn't been an arrest or a report out of incompetence, when the local newspaper of record shows up at the police station and asks for information about it, that information would have been forthcoming. And none of that happened here.
And I just want to pursue that one more time. But I think that when you become a journalist, particularly investigative journalist, dealing with institutions, part of what drives you too is you don't trust institutions to tell you what's going on. And that becomes somehow a motivator, driver for your journalism.
You can't trust them. Going in, you hope they turn out to be trustworthy, and didn't give them the benefit of the doubt. But your job is not to make that assumption that they're telling you the truth, that they're giving you all the information. Now, in this case, that was very easy. They made it so obvious. They wouldn't tell me things that are the most, they wouldn't give me the most basic kind of information. Well, when I went to the police station, and I purposely went in person because I thought this was a sensitive story. I thought it might be a competitive story. I don't want to immediately create an electronic paper trail and so forth. But, I was just given the stiff arm. The only record I was given was a call to service log, which was a routine document that the police department files if it accompanies, if it's part of a paramedic call. It wasn't even a crime report or anything. It was almost completely redacted. One good thing about it, though, is that the certain details, like the time of day, the location, the fact that there wasn't an overdose, matched exactly what Devon Kahn, the whistleblower, told me, which immediately went to his credibility, in a good way. So, you can't afford to trust institutions, from the get-go. And the fact is, I had experience with not just USC in the past and its lack of transparency, but the LA Times had experience with the Pasadena Police Department in the same way. And in fact, we had to sue them to get records. This was before this story happened. That should have been readily available. And so I knew what I was up against. So making that assumption was not difficult. The assumption that these folks could not be trusted, at least the leadership in these institutions.
And if I can, Kim, I want to pursue just one other
Sure.
personal piece that I found, Paul,
Sure.
because it's your story of getting the story, as well. I knew the headline, but I had none of the background. You talked about how you knew addiction in your family or alcoholism, and you knew the impact of these kinds of issues. And that seemed to also be a driver for you to kind of keep plowing through this. Those life experiences, are they part of the journalism, power inside an individual to be the kind of reporter that doesn't give up, to be dogged?
Yeah, they can't help but be part of it. Of course, you can't let that cloud your judgment, but you can't ignore it either. And in my case, over the years, it's made it easier for me to be empathetic with people who have gone through what my family has gone through, but in addition to sympathetic, but actually empathetic. And in this case, Sarah Warren was close in age to my two daughters, so I knew what her parents were going through. I could certainly identify with that. And again, there was alcohol and drugs have taken a heavy toll on my family, including my immediate family. So I knew what the stakes were, and that has to, even if you tell yourself it doesn't matter because you're going to chase the story anyway, which is true. It can't help but add to that motivation that, again, you know what the stakes are, you know what the harm here is, and you just got to get to the bottom of it. You got to keep going.
Does that, people are entrusting you with their stories, with their, they're taking a risk in speaking to you. And is there a particular, how do you cultivate that trust? How do you earn that trust? And especially in people who sort of aren't regular insider informants, but people like the Warrens or Devin Kahn?
That's the most important and often most difficult part of this type of story, earning that trust from people who, again, are putting everything on the line. You violate that trust, and they're the ones who are going to pay the price. So I get back to empathy, establishing that type of connection with folks. I assure them that I'm going to treat their information with respect and with care. I'm not going to surprise them in any way. They're not going to go online and suddenly see a story they didn't realize was coming, or themselves portrayed in a way they weren't expected. I'm going to emphasize again and again how I'm going to protect them. I often start off with a preliminary conversation completely off the record, just to see if we're comfortable with each other. And if we aren't, that conversation never occurred, and I move on. That's often very effective. And I basically make them feel, because it's true, that they are part of the story, that this is really their story, as well as anybody else, as much as anybody else's, if not more. And that's what I did in this case. But again, I can't downplay their bravery. I might have done a bad job at that, and I think they still would have come forward and did what they did. Again, they benefited in no way at all. I mean, it's not like they got anything out of this. I'm happy to take information from a source who has an axe to grind, who does see some benefit in talking to me, if the information is true and verifiable. We do that, but this is a completely different situation, as you know.
As someone who's on the receiving end of sort of reports of misconduct, I feel like there's a special, I'm calling it a burden. That sounds too, I don't want to make too much of it, but of being worthy of that trust and being able to make their story, make something come of their story, make it create change because of it, or get it out there. I feel like that's almost a covenant with folks who come forward, because there's so much skepticism in our society about whistleblowers, and so much labeling that it marginalizes whistleblowers, such as disgruntled employee, or they only did it because they're the same race or gender as this person, not because, as if people can't have altruistic motives. So So one of the staggering elements of this book, well, one was how happenstance it was that the Puliafito tip got to you when the formal systems failed. And I just throughout every time, it's breathtaking to think what would happen if that off the hand, over the kitchen table at a barbecue conversation hadn't taken place. So maybe you want to, I'll give you the other breathtaking piece is just how long these things went on, especially in the Tyndall case. It wasn't one incident. And we know from other scandals like the Larry Nassar at Michigan State with the USA gymnasts and Sandusky case at Penn State, that these crimes aren't specific to LA or USC, but what allows them to go on for decades? And they can't have been secret. So thoughts about sort of both of those observations.
Yeah, it's one of those things, I'm asked about it a lot, and I really don't have a good answer because it requires a failing on behalf of so many people in leadership positions that it's something, of course, that should never happen, but it did happen. And it happened in both of these cases. The Tyndall case went back to the 90s. So that's in a class of its own. But in the Puliafito case, there were complaints about his behavior for years. There wasn't the specificity about his drug use. There was some concern, though, including among higher ups, that he was using drugs. And what we have to remember about him, he wasn't just harming young people outside of the medical school. He was treating patients and performing delicate eye surgeries during that very long period when he was abusing drugs. There were plenty of signs there. He was reported for erratic and abusive behavior that was related to alcohol. Nothing was done. Getting back to Tyndall, as I detail in Bad City, there was just one report after another. And I think the pattern you see, and it is not unique to USC, is it's about individuals making decisions that are more about protecting themselves than protecting these people who are victims. And that eventually becomes protecting the institution, the higher up the ladder you go. And that's what happened. There was a point where once we found out, well, let me back up. So the university knows that I'm investigating the drug overdose and Puliafito. So while they're trying to stop that by throwing every obstacle in my way, the higher ups learn of what Tyndall did. Tyndall's now suspended. And they're learning more and more. Now we're taking their word for it at the very top that this is the first time they're learning the worst about him. So we'll give them that benefit of the doubt. But regardless of that, so they now have two very bad doctors. And you would think that the leadership of the university, starting with the president, Max Nikias, would say, you know what, enough is enough. This is out of control. We got to stop this, and we have to be transparent about it and bring everything, to an end. They chose the other route. They chose to conduct cover-ups on parallel tracks. And they somehow felt they would get away with that. In the Puliafito case, he did step down as dean after the overdose, the university, and he lied about the circumstances. They said he did that, and I mean lied to the USC community and by extension the public, that he did this to pursue a wonderful opportunity in biomed. He still remained on faculty. He continued to treat patients. And then 3 months later, even knowing that I'm investigating, and there was no question they knew that because by then I was in touch with the university, they gave him a public celebration. Well, public, it was out in the public. It was by invitation only. The president of the university was there, the provost, and his successor as the dean of the medical school. It was on the lawn at the medical school. I think 7 or 80 people attended, physicians and laboratory folks and so forth, singing this guy's praises, knowing what was going on, what went on behind the scenes. It was, and I attended this at a distance. I didn't, journalists can never trespass or anything like that. So I stood on a sidewalk and filmed it. And it was chilling. It was chilling, the brazenness of how they would not come clean about what this guy was up to, but sing his praises. And there were lots of jokes and funny anecdotes. I mean, it was appalling. But it gave me, it sent me a message that they thought in their arrogance, they were going to pull this off.
And do you have a sense of why they would, continue to not just sort of step back and maybe keep quiet and hope it goes away, but to really, kind of put the spotlight on him? Now, he's been a huge fundraiser and it's very successful, I guess. I was shocked he made $1 million a year. We at UNC don't make that kind of money.
That was just the base. That was the bit, because again, he had his own practice and so forth. Why would they do that? I think it was again, out of arrogance and out of confidence that they were going to get away with this, which says something about what they thought of the LA Times at that moment. At that moment, it was a very different LA Times as it is today and was in years before that. They were basically doubling down. You know how that is. They were hiding in plain sight. Not only did this guy not do anything wrong, but he was great. And look at all the people who turned out for this celebration to, tell us how wonderful he is. Well, and maybe it was a shot across my bow that, there's nothing here. Move on. You're never going to get this. There's nothing here you're going to get. But again, getting back to the earlier question, it just made me more determined.
And I guess, Kim, and I want to bring you in this because this is something I don't totally understand, but when you're dealing with ethics and you're trying to also share with our students and, really make ethical decisions, we're talking about the wonder of the whistleblowers because they felt ethics so deeply in their heart, they took risks. But there seems to be so many people in our bureaucracy or around in your story, Paul, that just said, I'm just keeping my mouth shut, or didn't do something, or didn't act to push it through, or demand a sort of answer. And I wonder about that group of people. Are they unethical? Are they lack of courage? Or are they just too timid? I don't know how to understand that.
Well, I think when you get into the management ranks, the upper management ranks, it's a lack of ethics, which to me, it grows out of selfishness, self-preservation of the greedy kind, the desire to cling to power, that sort of thing. I can understand when somebody at the bottom doesn't want to come forward because it would cost them their job, and they have bills to pay, they have families. Not everybody has the courage to put all of that on the line simply to do the right thing. I understand that. I understand that that kind of instinct. And then I think in the middle, there's just a lot of looking the other way because you're not quite sure you have the power to do anything about it. And again, there's a risk there, and maybe even a naive assumption that somebody above you will do the right thing and clean it all up. But man, in these two cases, nothing like that happened.
Yeah, it's so, it really is the part of the research on moral distress or work-related moral suffering is being subject to situations where you feel your moral, that the right thing to do is compromised by external or above, kinds of folks. I'll give a little plug for on Monday at noon to 1:15, we have a couple of researchers who do work on networks of complicity, and they're going to be speaking on campus. We're broadcasting it. We can share information in the chat later on, but it gets to some of these things we're talking about. And one of the things they talk about is why higher ed is particularly at risk of fostering these networks of complicity. So that's a little preview. The other thing I would say is the people in power get further away from the victims and less. You see this in the pedophilia scandal in the Catholic Church, right? It's the protecting the known, and sort of the victims are nameless, faceless, and numerous. And so it's not quite the compelling. And the principle of futility is really powerful. The feeling that the fix is in, nothing's going to change. People are, this job is wired. This guy's a rainmaker, or everyone before me has, gone on to speak about this, and nothing seems to be being done. So why should I put myself on? I mean, that's another. So the systems are failing, right? In a book I was reading recently called The Conscience Code, the author talks about ethics refugees, basically people that leave toxic workplaces, even at great cost to their career trajectories. And it made me think about the mostly women at the health center who kind of choreograph their activities in order to try to mitigate the damage by Tyndall. And I wonder how many people tried to be agents of change and just gave up and then voted with their feet, and how did the university fail to see a pattern in that, or did it care? And I'll just say, when I've done workshops on the Sandusky scandal at Penn State, one of the things I say is that, none of us are likely to be part of multi-decade pedophilia scandals, but most of us will work for organizations where powerful interests are protected. And whether that's the endowment or the alumni or whatever system, that's one of the observations. Let me ask a question, if I can, from the chat, which has to do with, and either of you can respond, but what are medical schools particularly fertile areas for this unethical behavior? Are they particularly risky? One of the folks mentioned medical school leadership involved with the pharma, OxyContin, McKinsey, kind of promotional activities as one example. So I don't know, are med schools susceptible?
I have a thought on that.
Okay.
In the case of USC, certainly, and it's not the only case, the medical school is the cash cow for USC by far. I mean, it's tremendously important to USC's bottom line. And tied into that is maintaining the university's reputation overall. And then we get into university rankings. To me, all those things were tied together at USC. And the leadership of USC, in my view, starting many years ago, began running the school as a business more than as an institution of higher learning. So, and it's a private business with a very passive board of directors, which we've certainly found to be the case. So, you have an abusive doctor in a medical school. What is your instinct? Not to let it become public. If you have a drug abusing and drug trafficking dean, the same thing. So to me, again, it's a moral failure on their part, but the motivation behind it ultimately at USC, from everything I think my colleagues would agree, was money. And, prestige brings in money, and money builds prestige. And it was clear to me that the leadership was obsessed with that. And that's the motivation. And, I don't think it would happen in the English department. English departments don't generate any money, really. Other ways I can see the medical school being fertile ground is that you have so many people, these are doctors, and there's a power dynamic right there. And we've seen that abused. We see that abused all the time. And when you have a concentration of that in one place, I think the likelihood that you're going to see something like this, maybe not at this scale, but something along the same lines is higher.
Yeah, I can also imagine lots more opportunities for conflicts of commitment with industry engagements or their clinical. I mean, that may not be available. I would see that potentially possible in a business school too, but other, especially professional schools, may not have those opportunities for outside engagements that then conflict with the medical school responsibilities.
Yeah, and in the case of Puliafito, he was leading an effort he was described as the quarterback of this by USC to poach a research lab at the University of California at San Diego on Alzheimer's that was worth hundreds of millions of dollars in potential grants, very lucrative. So what would happen if, this became a legal dispute, a very heated one between the two universities. So what would happen if all of a sudden, the so-called quarterback of this effort is on the front page of the LA Times as a drug abuser and a drug trafficker? That's not good. That's not good. So there is another motivation, all about money, real money, to keep it quiet, to cover it up.
Or to try to hope that the short term, to play the short term game versus the long term game, right? And hope that. I want to change this a little bit, and I know there are other questions, and I'll weave them in as it fits. But when I think about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which led to, we still have reverberating implications of it today, as we see in healthcare, health disparities, et cetera. It took the involvement of an investigative journalist, Jean Heller, to break that. 40 years, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments went on. 13 referee journal articles were written about it. And blowing the whistle via the news media seems like an action of last resort. People only seem to go there when other things have failed. And so I wonder, especially with the tenuous, dynamic situation in journalism these days, what's the future of investigative journalism? Is there an appetite even for companies to have what seems like a pretty risky and time-intensive arm? So I'm just interested in your thoughts about that.
Well, I think there is a future. I think we're in the middle of a crisis right now because of how many jobs have been lost in journalism, particularly in the print media, which in many ways doesn't, we're all multimedia now in these newspaper companies, but there have been devastating losses just of bodies, and that includes people who do investigative reporting. There's some encouraging models out there, nonprofits. There are some relatively new websites that are doing more of this, but a hell of a lot more needs to be done. And I can tell you from my experience at the LA Times, and I think you'll find this elsewhere, these stories work for the organization in every way, in readership, in revenues. People love this type of journalism. We keep track of all of our metrics now, how many readers each story gets, how many of those who aren't subscribers become subscribers after reading this type of journalism, and they're extremely encouraging. We do investigative stories, do great in all these areas. And to me, that should be an incentive to just do more of it, and, even where it's already being done. I know it's easier said than done because investigative reporting is expensive. It takes a long time to do these stories quite often, and there are legal risks. Those risks can certainly be mitigated just with care and that sort of thing. But but we got a long way to go. But I am optimistic that something will emerge that fixes the problem longer term.
I kind of wanted to pursue a little bit there.
Yes, please.
I think some stations trying to build trust with their audience have created, particularly some television stations. I can think of one of my alums who in San Francisco, they became they wanted to be known. Their brand was they investigated because they wanted to link with their audience. And he is now left and is part of an NBC commitment. So but I don't think they do year-long investigations like you did, Paul. You know what I mean? They may go in and try to fix things but so many things. I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of leaks. In your book, you talk about leaks being the currency of really journalism. And if you go Pentagon Papers, which I always read on our First Amendment Day in the pit, that's our sort of center of campus, because the Pentagon Papers were banned, right? And it was secret papers, and yet it revealed so much about the United States. And now we all think why was that, why was that banned? So what are the ethics of leaks? Because they're very frightening to institutions, that people, and there can be a question on the part of people whether they should give leaks, and we can talk a little bit about that ethics, but what's your idea of the ethics of leaks, Paul?
That they're absolutely essential. And it's usually ethical people leaking the information for good reason. Without leaks, I don't know where we would be. And that's unfortunate because it's really due to, again, a lack of transparency by these organizations. When I go to a police department for something that's supposed to be a public record and a leadership department buries it, what am I left for? What am I left with? A leaker. Hopefully somebody will leak it to me. Same thing at a university. My best sources on these USC stories going back well before the Pulitzer one were inside the university, leaking me information that if they were found out, they would be fired. They're whistleblowers in a way. They're just undercover. So I understand that organizations hate it. Everybody wants to control the information, and this is the opposite of that. But it's absolutely essential. After the Pulitzer story ran, and the Times ended up with new leadership, both on the corporate level and in the newsroom, a number of us on staff became leakers to other publications because of our concern about what these people were doing to the newspaper. Now, in a healthy newspaper, you don't need to do that because a newspaper covers itself. And that's another way of building trust with readers, exposing your own flaws. Again, covering yourself when it's bad news. Well, at that time, at the LA Times, that was not going to happen. And it had happened for many years, and it's happening again. So yeah, we became leakers, but you can only get so much from records. I file public records requests all the time, both under the state law and FOIA, and that's an honor system. If the government doesn't want to comply, it's really tough to get the government to comply. Now, the Times and on my stories and many others have sued and some of these agencies, and quite often successfully, but that's very expensive. It takes a very long time. It's not a real solution. So we have to come back to human sources leaking things.
And I just wanted to say, I think it's hard on people because there's being loyal to the newsroom. If you're the leaker in the newsroom, or are you loyal to the university? Are you loyal to your school? Are you loyal to your business or to your research opportunity? You're part of it. So I wanted to say this one insight I had on Ethics Month, Kim, is having done some reading and was at a lecture yesterday, that it's not, maybe we need to expand beyond, is it right or good or bad? So leaking is good if you're getting the leak, bad if you're the person who is the subject of it. So what is the person who is loyal to their institution to do? It's a question of what's better or worse. Is it better to keep something you found quiet, or is it worse? And I think that it indicates sometimes what motivates a leaker. They may be so worried about what's not out there in the public square that they've decided to take that leap.
There's Rush Kidder in his book, How Good People Make Tough Choices. And at the Institute on Global Ethics, they basically put all ethical dilemmas into a set, at least one of four competing goods. And one of the competing goods is truth versus loyalty. We're told something in the workplace about, something that's coming down the pike, and the information's embargoed or whatever. Or we receive information under the cover of confidentiality as a therapist, as a journalist, whatever. And yet, it's sort of, loyalty is good, and so is truth telling. And when there are competing goods, how do you decide? And I think you alluded to this in your original question, Susan, but the communications apparatus, at least of USC, seemed that the ability to maintain the wall of silence and the lack of transparency as a trend is just something that institutionally, it seems unhealthy. I don't know that total transparency is possible or appropriate, but it just seems like opacity is not helpful either.
In my experience, leakers, so the great majority of leakers I've dealt with who are leaking information that they know is going to be bad for the leadership of their institutions, believe it's going to be good for the institution.
Mhm.
Long term. You know, that, yeah, people are going to get fired, they're going to be embarrassed. It's going to be a rough time because they represent the institution. So it will be a rough time for the institution in the short term, but longer term, it's for the health of the institution.
So in a way, Kim, that's a loyalty to the idea of the institution.
Right.
That's a form of loyalty, and they do.
It
and
can
they-
also be a short-term, it can be a short-term, long-term, and an individual versus other. Keeping quiet and keeping my powder dry is good for me, but it's not good for the people that are being harmed by this person or for this organization I care about. Short-term, long-term, same. Keeping quiet or speaking up will have long-term implications and sort of that utilitarian piece. So I love that paradigm.
And so, and they sometimes they struggle with that too, because it's a gamble. Will it hurt these people so much that the damage to the institution might be long lasting? So there is a calculation they have to make. But I don't see any other way. I mean,
One of the heartbreaking experiences I have with whistleblowers is when people say, I don't want them to get in trouble, I just want it to stop.
I hear that.
And that is, it's heartbreaking because sometimes our systems aren't set up to handle things in a timely and nuanced way. Can I ask a question? This is sort of off the chat line. And it has to do with, as a journalist that was impacted by LA Times leadership, how should leaders handle valid differences in risk tolerance? And a similar question came up about the rules of publishing with risk, and how that's mitigated. So if you want to speak to those, Paul.
Well, I think the system was in place to do that very effectively, and it's in place now, and it's very straightforward. As journalists, you make a judgment whether something, whether the information is important enough to be published. That's usually a pretty simple judgment, and certainly in this case it was. People were being hurt. These institutions that were involved are very important institutions to the public at large. So you get that information out, and could there be a back and forth? And the best way to do that, of course, as in any enterprise of that sort. But there comes a bottom line where when you have the story, and you've done everything to not just to make sure, but to absolutely guarantee that the story is true in every detail, it's passed the legal, review, then you publish it. And no investigative story is absolutely risk-free. Is lawsuit proof. People can sue you over nothing. It doesn't cost a lot of money to file a lawsuit, and that happens. But they certainly can be made to be judgment proof, that they're true. And and truth is an absolute defense against libel. And that was certainly the case in these stories. And the system was in place. It was how the system, the protocols were in place. It was how they were not followed, in my view.
And I'll note, aspect of the book, sort of a through line, is the sort of newsroom drama about the challenges you and your colleagues face that you're speaking to in getting the Puliafito story to publication, and allegations or the contention that the Times leadership stalled or tried to kill the story outright. And without getting into the sort of back and forth, and so we will post, and the rejoinder to that, whether it holds water or not, is that they were held up in a surfeit of caution or meticulous fact checking. Although I think you made the case that it had passed legal and fact checking before the stories got slow walked. At any rate, we'll post in the chat, my colleagues will post in the chat some of the articles that the former leaders of the LA Times have posted in this regard. But let me ask this, and Susan, you may address this too. Each of us has a line. I think each of us carries a line that we think we won't cross, or a compromise we won't make when faced with troubling behavior in our personal environment or our work environment. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts about how do we know when we're up against the line, when, this is, when we're not going, when it's time to call the question, to blow the whistle, to be the leaker, et cetera.
Is that for?
Yeah,
that-
I'll start with you, and then Susan can speak to it too.
Well, I met that line in this case, where I had no confidence the story was going to be published, certainly not with any kind of dispatch and not in a complete form. So I complained about it at the corporate level. My one regret is that I didn't do that much sooner. In my reporting on Puliafito, at one point, I reached out to ethicists to discuss his lack of ethics in what he did, including involving his patients. And they pointed out to me, the ethicists, well, the LA Times has an ethical responsibility to go public with this information as soon as possible, because, there are people being hurt. And I agreed with that, and I made that case with my superiors, and that was about 3 months before the story ran. And at that point, the story was complete. So yeah, that's that's when I should have recognized that I am crossing that line through my own inaction, by not going to the corporate level, and that's when I did. I didn't do that for quite, for almost 2 months later. And I was concerned that, that if I did, it could backfire, that it could actually end up guaranteeing that the story wouldn't be published, because I didn't have a relationship with the people at the corporate level. I didn't know if they would take me seriously. I was going through the same sort of things that the whistleblowers using my stories go through. I had to make that judgment. And again, my one regret is I should have done it sooner, because when I did, it worked.
And I guess I don't have the stomach to do the kind of some of the investigative reporting that you've done, Paul, because sometimes when I've done some stories that I knew were dangerous, I knew they would destroy the family. The facts were there, but it was really hard I found that hard, right? So there was a certain ability, it was easier for me to cover things that didn't get so deep into it. But I would say two things. Is I never wanted to cover friends. So sometimes in Washington, you'd become friends with people, somebody you might have been auxiliary on a campaign. I covered presidential campaigns. And when they became news stories, because they might have moved up, I said, I didn't want to cover those. I just didn't feel I could get into the names because I had a friendship with them and it wasn't necessary for it. I would say one other thing, I have only one story that I ever regretted I told. And I was sort of pushed by my editors to tell it was more gossip than fact. And I carefully wrote it, that because these things were swirling around. And I did not have it down in fact. So Paul, just the opposite, they wanted it that night because television is that way. And I've always regretted that story because I feel that I'm a reporter who dealt with facts, not with gossip. And it was more gossip, but because I had covered this campaign, people felt I knew more than I probably knew. So it had an impact that I, to this day, regret. But it's only one story.
Well, yeah, the pressure of times, especially in your business, that's a whole other thing. When something needs to get out, when it's news, it's breaking news.
Yeah.
Well, it's, obviously the risks are higher to getting everything right. You don't have the luxury of time that an investigative piece gives you. So it's just not easy.
But Puliafito was, correct me if I'm wrong, he was doing eye surgery during this process, right?
Sure was. And beyond that, he was threatening the family of the young woman. He was providing more and more drugs to these vulnerable young people. including to a young woman who later had a baby. It wasn't his baby, but he continued to provide her with drugs, and the baby died with methamphetamine in his body. There was an investigation. There were no charges brought, but I often wonder if the stories had run sooner. And certainly the initial story, which would have led to follow-ups running much sooner, would that not have happened to the baby? That's something you can't help but think about. So yeah, this was a bad situation, and we needed to get this story out as soon as possible in a responsible way, and it didn't happen.
And let's talk about that just a little bit, because one of the things that happens is reporters often tell part of the story. They don't know the whole story. It will reveal over time. And so a little bit of the ethics of the scoop is the way I'm going to call it, Paul, because in book 2, you talk about you were worried that it would get out there because all of a sudden he resigned without giving a good explanation, after this incident, but before anything was in the paper. So you were worried too, if you didn't report, it could go somewhere else. So many people don't trust reporters because they think we're just out there to get scoops, Talk about how the process sometimes begins and continues, or do you have to wait until the entire story is tied up? Give people here a better insight into the ethics of when you publish.
Sure, that's great. I actually specialize in what we call run and gun investigations, which means that once you get an initial story, enough to publish, it's not the complete story, but it's newsworthy enough and important enough that you have to publish it. I do that knowing that initial story will lead to more and more stories. And I've done it a great many times with a lot of success. And that's exactly what I attempted to do here. The cover-up was continuing at USC. I reached, I concluded for good reason that was not going to change unless disclosure forced the issue, disclosure through a story. Same was true with the Pasadena Police Department. But I did reach a point where I had a story that was very important that needed to be published, and it wasn't published. And it had, the basic elements in it, the fact that there was an overdose, that he was present at the overdose, drugs were found in his room. He stepped down mysteriously, bizarrely, as dean in the middle of the term on a Thursday afternoon, effective immediately, that USC was silent on the matter. I did have comments from the police, saying that, yeah, those drugs were found in the room, and the young woman who was still not identified because of medical privacy, that she did overdose on those drugs. I had the 911 recording with the dean's voice on it, lying to the dispatcher that the young woman only was drinking. Pretty horrible behavior by a physician. And of course, I had, the cooperation of what happened inside that room from the whistleblower. That's certainly enough for a story. Now, was it do we have everything? Do we have all the videos and photos and all the other players that we later found? No, but that would have happened if we had published that first story, because that's how it works. In fact, I heard from the Warren family later that if that story had run months earlier than the revived story eventually ran, they would have been on the phone with me the same day. And everything would have been, advanced by a number of months. And that's routine. We do that all the time. You don't have to wait to have every question answered. We often publish stories to get questions answered, to force people to talk, to address things. Imagine if that story ran. And again, we don't know, we don't have the full identity of the woman yet. We don't have all the details, but there's a story in the LA Times about this dean being at the scene of an overdose. And the last we heard from USC is that, he's just a wonderful guy, terrific fundraiser who happened to step down as dean to take an opportunity, in a biomed field. You think that would have held up for 5 minutes once that story's out? No. We would have USC would have been forced to finally, address it in whatever way, it could. But that would have, again, led to more and more reporting.
In some of the research I've done, workplaces have terminated problem employees, and sometimes it's very difficult to terminate people. So they've been kind of, okay, this person's done unethical things, we're done with them, but they don't go a step further for example, to that person's licensing board. It seems in neither of these cases did the medical boards that regulate physicians get in. I mean, there were a lot of people who could have reported the smuggling of drugs into the rehab facilities. Can you speak to that about why you think it didn't go to why the medical boards weren't brought into it?
I think it's the same. It was the same motivation to keep things as quiet as possible, to limit scrutiny. The medical board isn't exactly the most transparent parent agency in California. It's the opposite. But there's something there. There could be some record there that could pique our interest. And they just didn't want to do that. And Susan, getting back to your question about scoops, because I went in more detail about, getting that first story out. Of course, if you're worried about being beaten on a story, it's going to energize you more, but it doesn't, you still exercise the same amount of care in what you're reporting, and I certainly did that in this case. But getting back to the medical board, to me, that was one of the most outrageous things, that these administrators knew at minimum that the dean of the medical school, who was again performing surgeries, otherwise treating patients, had these behavioral problems that likely involved alcohol and drugs. And they, just to protect the university itself, allowed him to continue to do that, to continue engage in that kind of behavior, and cause whatever harm might result to others. Tyndall, the same thing. They didn't report him to the medical board. They did, in essence, fire him. Well, they gave him a payoff and made him go away. And they, that permitted him to continue to do whatever, he was capable of to young women, his patients, with no result, as he had for decades. To me, that was, in both cases, a moral crime on behalf of the leadership of the university.
I feel like we should know, the audience, if they don't know, what's happened to the two doctors too. Where are they now? They can't practice.
Yes, they both lost their medical licenses. USC only reported Tyndall to the medical board after we began our reporting, and they got wind of that. Puliafito, they only reported him to the medical board. In fact, I'm not even sure that USC did. I think it happened the day the story ran. The medical boards started an investigation. Puliafito has tried to get his license back. I think he's doing that again. Tyndall's awaiting trial on 30-some felonies in connection with his case. He's not going to get his license back. But again, all of this should have happened much earlier. I mean, ideally, it would have happened without the LA Times. These people would have been reported and stopped, but just
well, and as the super sleuths in my book group noted, Puliafito's spouse was a physician.
yeah.
So, there are, I'll leave that there. I want to go back to this whole thing about investigative reporting for a second, because and the importance of the institution from which the investigative report is issued, because yes, there are a lot of really good nonprofit and solo bloggers and people, but correct me if I'm wrong, but there should be some kind of capital, some kind of power in showing up and saying, I represent the LA Times, and that this was published in the LA Times versus Joe Blogger, investigative journalist. I mean, am I being an institutionalist for thinking that it's important to have the masthead, the paper of record, whatever, even if it's sullied by, competitive issues or whatever, that's important?
I think it's very important because of our track record. We can be trusted. We make mistakes, we publish corrections all the time, but overall, over the long haul, we do have that authority, that you can trust our journalism. I'm not discounting what bloggers are doing. They might be doing great work too, but we also have reach. And when we publish something like this, the people in power have to take it seriously. They can't dismiss it as just some blogger or I never heard of that website. this is in their face. It's the Los Angeles Times. And they might not have had the moral courage to do anything until now, until the story's published, but now they might have a political motivation to do something, the self-preservation, heading off legal problems. That's what happened at USC too. So I think that's very, very important. It gets back to how, it's just critical that we maintain these investigative functions, these news outlets, and grow them. That's what I hope will happen at the LA Times. Just want to say that the LA Times was on a collision course with a Death Star at this time. We were in horrible hands corporately, our corporate owners, and they were going to bleed us dry, and we're going to end up just being another more fodder for another company to come along, one of these firms that buys distressed newspapers and again just squeezes what they can out of them and then shuts them down. That we really were on that type of course. And because the staff essentially rose up against this ownership, and because of the great reporting done outside the LA Times about what was happening at the LA Times, the owner at the time was forced to sell it to Patrick Soon-Shiong, Dr. Soon-Shiong, our current owner, and he has revived it. He has added 140, 150 journalists to the staff. It's something that's not happening. Hasn't happened in most places. Our investigative team has been built up. I hope it gets built up more. But we're back. And we're doing this work, and we're doing it the right way. You're not going to see a story stay out of the paper again for 9 months when it's ready to go. I make the point in the book that under our new, even before the company was sold, under our new editorial leadership in the newsroom, the Tyndall story, which was just as hard hitting, if not more so, and certainly had the same legal risks, if not more, was published within 3 weeks of the draft being filed. And that's the way it's supposed to work. That's the way it worked for me for many years at the LA Times until this episode.
And I have to say that, there has been a complete, the news business as we've known it has been under challenge, particularly economically, since advertising went away and digital built up. And I have to be an optimist. I'm producing all these young journalists and they are getting opportunities. But, I point to the Knight Center at the Hussman School and our now retired professor, Penny Abernathy, who cataloged all the changes going on in the business, and news deserts. That was a phrase she used to talk about how many newspapers closed, and ghost newspapers, which were ones that may have been hard-hitting city newspapers that now had half, a third of the staff they had before. And in this time, how much has not come to the public, to the civic moment, to know about your leadership, to know the kinds of things going on. So it is a very challenging time. I just have to feel optimistic that I see in my students a drive to be leaders in the community, to tell the stories that matter, not just to entertain. There's certainly many that might want to tell really wonderful stories, but it is a moment of real change. And that's part of the understory too of Bad City, I think, is that kind of change in who's in charge. And leadership matters. Media leadership matters a lot.
Yeah, we're an institution as well.
Yeah.
One that the public is supposed to trust, and the public should believe that we're looking out for them, and that gets back to leadership. We're as good as our leadership.
And I wonder if I can indulge in one question, asking Paul a question I'm sure he won't want to answer. But since all the journalism schools that I know, the great ones, are also producing communication leaders, who might go into advertising and branding and sell things, and to public relations, okay? And we teach them to be ethical leaders. So I kind of want, what do you think institutions, which many of them will go into, what do they owe the public? What do you think our young PR professionals ought to know about what your perspective is about how they represent these institutions and serve the public?
Well, first of all, they shouldn't lie. And the public, there is a public relations code of ethics.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it in a while, but I think that's that principle is throughout that code of
Yeah,
ethics.
Arthur Page is #1, do not lie.
Why not? Unfortunately, that happens a lot. It just does. And in some case, they're lies of omission. They just don't. They know the truth, but they won't tell it to you because they're protecting their institution, their corporation, whatever, or their government agency, whatever it is. But yeah, I expect them to tell the truth, to make the same calculation that we do. Is the public being harmed? Are we doing something bad that we need to stop doing and become open about that? That does happen sometimes, but just not nearly enough. But it's really gotten, to me, that's gotten worse. The lack of transparency and openness, because it's become easier through electronic communications. I resisted for years doing interviews by email. I remember, in fact, I was up against the Catholic Church some years ago, and the public relations person for this archdiocese insisted I put all my questions in writing. Well, to me, I've been in this business so long that that was foreign to me. No, I want to interview you so I have an opportunity to ask follow-up questions, so I can go, expand my queries in other areas. And they just refused. And I was kind of a holdout. And eventually my editor, unfortunately, said, well, we're going to have to do it this way. We fought over that, but now it's the standard. Now, back then I made the case that how do I know the answers I get in an email are coming from the person I emailed, even though the name might be on it. So this might sound like ancient history, but it's easier now for people to hide behind these screens, and we get, because it's easier now to do sort of document dumps where the response isn't something that's really on point, but they send you a bunch of records. That's kind of a crisis PR technique. They fill your inbox with 1,000 pages of ultimately meaningless records and other types of documents because, it makes it look like they're being responsive and they're not. So it just seems, the truth is just sort of secondary. But again, there are exceptions.
I mean, one of the questions I had for you both is how do you deal with liars? And so I appreciate wading into this. And I think you even talk in the book about sort of getting some anodyne communication back, or something that you need to read between the lines or to understand what's been left out. And also, experience the lies of omission, or the lies that are, we consulted with our ethics experts about this, and what's not said is, and they told us absolutely not to do it. But that part gets left out of the, and so, are there other thoughts about, and I think you're right that written, screens and keyboards probably make it easier to lie or to, prevaricate, whatever we want to call it. I don't know if there are other strategies from your experiences that you would recommend for the rest of us.
Well, what I've had to do, and then this has become so routine that it is now the routine. It's the standard. I'm dealing with an agency now that the leaders of the agency will not grant me an interview. That is also becoming routine. Just no to an interview. And instead you go through the PR person, and all the questions have to be in writing, and the responses, in this case, far more often than not, are non-responses. They're words, but they're not really responses. I file records requests. They run out the clock whenever they can on that. It's all about just either, at minimum, stalling the story, limiting the story's, inquiries, that sort of queries. And my only solution so far is, again, human sources, people on the inside blowing the whistle, including to me, on background, leaking stuff to me. That's it. In this agency in particular, I have good, very good sources, and I'll get either the lie or the obfuscation from the official spokesperson, and I'll get the truth from the source. Once I corroborate that, it gets published. It's like this cat and mouse game that's just, it's nonsensical, but it has become the routine. I don't know what to do about it, you know?
And I think it's very difficult.
PR. I know people in PR who I got to know in most cases because they were journalists who have quit jobs because they were being forced, you know, pressured anyway to lie. You know, so there are plenty of ethical PR people, certainly. I don't want the brush to be too broad, but yeah, and I think governments, it should never happen in government. But it does. I want to say, at least in my experience, it might happen more often in government, that initial instinct, that initial response is no response. Get in his way as much as possible.
And I guess for me, the other question that you asked about what do you do when you're lied to? And I'm sure you feel this way, Paul. Once you're lied to as a reporter, you never trust that person again, whether they're in position of influence or someone you're dealing with. It's the death knell for that person. But now people tell, you know, lies to your face, on television, in interviews. And so it's a really hard thing, I think, particularly for journalists to deal with, you know, that outright lie, because if you, for instance, repeat it, you know, how are you? So it's a real dilemma. And I think you have to, have some evidence, which people don't always have at their hand, be able to show the difference between what the evidence is and what the lie is. But that's one of the, I think, dilemmas of our time, the willingness of people in public life to lie.
And I think they're, sadly learning that the bigger the lie, the more effective it might be. You know, make your lie as broad as possible. Lies are labor intensive. It takes a lot of to knock them down.
Right.
And we try to, as much as we can. If we feel we have to publish the lie because it's the other side or it's the denial, whatever, if we do have the information showing that it's not true, we do publish that.
I'm going to teach a leadership course, which is why I read your book this summer. And it will be one of the things that students can pick to read, because I want them to see the inside of the different media organizations, which they may go into. And so I thought it was an insightful book because it's your story. It's not the LA Times story. It's your story of how it came to be. And it's a compelling story. But I feel like leadership is one of the most important pieces of our time, particularly in the media, because it's so fraught financially. It's so fraught in terms of how it's changing digitally. We don't know what the answers are. We're in a period of sort of real change. And so that if you're going to be a media leader, you have to be innovative, et cetera. But I also think particularly, I think particularly in communications, I won't say just in the journalism, you have to be able to be willing to resign from a job if you're being asked to do something that breaks your ethics. I think you just have to be prepared and maybe put into that position.
And I hope that came through in Bad City, where these people, my colleagues, who were in a much more vulnerable position than I was, my 4 reporter colleagues who joined me on this bigger team that we put together, they didn't have to do that. And I would have been perfectly understandable. They, 3 of them, I think, were in their 20s. One had only been at the paper 7 or 8 months, baby, they all had, bills. They weren't making a lot of money. And I asked them, with my editor, Matt Late, to join this effort that was not getting any support from the leadership. And in that case, in that sense, was very risky. And they did not hesitate. And if they had, again, I would have been perfectly understanding of that. And they certainly would have been willing to resign or to get fired to, if that's what it took to pursue this story, no question.
And Paul, you and I've had this conversation about the people that are willing to take risks, whether it's whistleblowers or the like, are often the people with the most to lose. I did a talk for a group of administrative assistants once about moral courage, and they said it all begins when he tells you to say, tell them I'm not here when he's in the office. And I think your statement about the effort to keep a lie going is very poignant, because there's a lot of collateral damage of the people lower on the totem pole who are supposed to shore that up. I'm mindful of our time, and so very grateful for this conversation. One of the questions that came in, I'll just speak to it, and then I'll ask each of you for a little wrap up. One of the questions that came in is, what can we do for whistleblowers? And certainly in some situations, there are not only whistleblower protections, but whistleblower compensation for, especially when federal funds are involved or being misused. I would say the best, and you all may have experiences as well, I'd say speaking truth to power, going against the current is a very lonely enterprise. People will often tell me, people who've been whistleblowers, they'll say, well, people are glad you did it, but they don't want to sit with you in the lunchroom anymore. And so I think the very least that we can do in the times that we can't be the whistleblower ourselves, or we're going to stand down for whatever reason, is not to let those people be out on the end of the limb alone. And there's a great Martin Luther King quote about the trauma, not just of the words of our enemies, but more the silence of our friends. And so those are, I think the question kind of had to do with programmatic supports and other kinds of things. And many organizations have protections for whistleblowers, but retaliation can be very subtle and persistent, and not always confident whistleblowers are protected, even when we hope to do so. So I just wanted to answer that question. So closing comments, Susan, do you mind going first?
Thank you for opening my mind to all the scholarship around ethics and moral courage. I just was not aware of it. And it sort of, I think, adds to the importance of journalism as a profession to understand the dynamic. And I would just say one thing you can do is, if you're on a board of a nonprofit or in governance, make sure there's whistleblower protection in the governance words, because that then puts it on the line of the board that there may be people, and that's part of the board's responsibility, but that it's actually built into the system of a nonprofit or in the governance of an organization. That is key best practice.
Thank you.
I agree with that. Certainly at universities, that should be in the bylaws of every university, whistleblower protections. And we certainly need more laws. Absolutely. There are some laws in California that echo the federal law, including for cases of sexual harassment, I believe. We need more of that. And otherwise, we need to celebrate whistleblowers as much as we can. And I think what you're doing, again, as Susan mentioned, your scholarship can be a big help. If people come out of our universities with that kind of, infused with that kind of principle, that could certainly help. I didn't have that kind of training. I took a basic class in media law, which included a brief section on ethics. But yeah, whistleblowers, they're heroes, and we got to treat them that way.
Susan, you shared a quote from the Carnegie Council, and it would be, we're going to share Brett's sharing it, but if you would summarize that.
Yeah, it's the Carnegie Council on Ethics in International Affairs, but it's really focusing and created Ethics Day. And the idea was that it needs to remember in our personal lives and our lives as citizens that there are rarely two choices, my right versus your wrong. There is one area in ethics that can play an essential role. In other words, just really sorting out what are the ethics of something. It's not just either or, good or bad. It's really determining it. And it's not the cure-all for the world's problems, but it is an actual process for finding solutions. And so I think ethics seemed like an old-fashioned sort of idea. There is perhaps nothing more in our society right now when we're dealing with things like the Ukraine war and, the kinds of issues that are on our agenda than to really sort through what are the ethics, what are the solutions that really serve our society. And so I'm thrilled to be on that board, but I thought, some of these people laugh, there are no ethics. No, ethics can be an antidote to the kind of nihilism that we're experiencing.
And ethics are a reporters, most potent weapon. And people in power get that. I mean, when they realize that you can't be bought, you can't be compromised, you're just going to keep pursuing the truth, on your ethics, that becomes our most potent weapon. It like the 5 reporters who took down these 2 institutions and the leadership, we didn't have any power except for the truth, our devotion to the ethics of our profession. And the bad guys often get that, or people, more importantly, the people who are about to become bad guys get that, and they realize it's not going to work. They come clean.
I cannot thank you, Susan and Paul, enough for making the time to be here today, for engaging in this conversation. I want to thank the ethics and policy team for all the behind the scenes work. Really want to thank the inspiration and cautions that the book offers. I'm very grateful for that enduring message, and also I'm thankful for the people who endeavor to strengthen our communities and our organizations, and also for the folks who are attending. Record recordings of our events through the Office of Ethics and Policy live on our Ethics and Policy at UNC website. And Brent can post the link, or has post the link, reminder of the book's availability. Also, reminder of the event that we have on Monday, the 24th, 12 to 1:15, where maybe we can help untangle some of these how enduring open secrets of unethical behavior endure, and what we can do to try to dismantle them. So thank you all, and especially thanks to my fellow panelists.
And Paul, it's a real page turner. You write well.
Thanks. It was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.